Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series called Revolt against King John. In this episode, A New Monarch, we will talk about how John's early victories against the rebel barons were thwarted by the arrival of Prince Louis of France, whom the rebels wished to make their new king. However, when William Marshal took over the king's war effort, he defeated the French and the rebels, and England emerged from the war much changed. During the first 16 years of his reign, King John alienated and enraged the French-speaking barons of England by losing their ancestral homeland of Normandy. John then taxed the barons to the hilt to raise an army to reclaim Normandy, and then led them to a crushing defeat at the hands of King Philip Augustus of France. The barons, having seen so much of their wealth squandered, forced King John to respect their property rights by making him sign the Great Charter or Magna Carta. John, being the trustworthy fellow he was, immediately went back on his promise and sent his agents to Europe to raise an army of mercenaries that would suppress the rebel barons. To win French support and obtain a replacement king, the barons offered the English crown to Prince Louis, the son of the King of France. The first great battle of this civil war took place at Rochester Castle, which fell to John's forces after a grueling 7-week siege at the end of 1215. After this victory, King John and his army marched across the east of England. In January 1216, King John reached as far north as Berwick-on-Tweed, where the Scots had taken advantage of the English Civil War by laying siege to the town. John drove out the Scots, captured the city, and burned down most of the major buildings in doing so. However, by that time, a small French fleet arrived in London, and its commander informed the rebels that Prince Louis would soon arrive in England. The arrival of Prince Louis was sped along when John's fleet was badly damaged by a storm in May 1216. That left the way open for Prince Louis to sail to England only days later with an army of French soldiers. Prince Louis recruited the services of a mercenary pirate named Eustace the Monk, a former churchman who led pirate ships that preyed on shipping in the English Channel. For a time, Eustace had served John by raiding French towns, but after the two fell out, Eustace did anything he could to help the French, including ferrying Louis across the Channel. Soon after he landed, Prince Louis easily captured Rochester Castle from the small garrison John left behind, and he formally claimed the English throne on May 21, 1216. Prince Louis then marched across England, capturing Winchester and its castle. Rebel barons allied with Prince Louis besieged the royal-held castles at Windsor and Dover. However, bringing in a French monarch to replace the Plantagenet dynasty cost the rebels a potential ally in William Marshal, who was both Earl of Pembroke and Marshal of England. Though the Marshal had supported Magna Carta, he viewed replacing John with a French prince as a step too far and set out to crush the rebellion. The Marshal's task became much easier when King John died at Newark in October 19, 1216. At the time, King John was preparing another campaign against Louis and the rebels, but he died of dysentery not long after losing his baggage train in the Wash estuary, just as the tide came in and took away his carts. According to local lore, there was a collection of John's prized jewels in the wagons, but they have never been found. Just 9 days later, John's eldest son Henry was crowned King Henry III, despite being only 9 years old at the time. William Marshal was declared his regent. With John's death, the rebels' primary complaint vanished, and they had a new king in whom they could place their hopes. Not long after, rebel barons allied with Louis began joining William Marshal. Fighting began again in the spring of 1217 when the rebel army surrounded the French-held Montsorel Castle in Lincolnshire. William Marshal himself, then 70 years old, led the royal forces against the besieging rebels on May 20th, 1217. In a rousing speech, the Marshal boasted that he would break the French line by charging a weak point in their formations. The aging knight made good his boast and drove the French forces from the battlefield. The king's men followed up this victory with a naval triumph in August 1217 at the Battle of Sandwich. Eustace the monk was using his vessels to bring much-needed reinforcements and supplies to Prince Louis in England. However, a flotilla of royal ships approached the monk's fleet from behind. The royal ships grappled with the French pirate vessels before they boarded them, and according to lore, the king's men threw pots filled with powdered lime at the French pirates to blind them before their attack. In this way, the king's men captured the monk's flagship. They found Eustace hiding in the bilge and dragged him up onto the deck before they chopped his head off. The royal fleet then towed 65 captured French ships into England. After the monk's defeat, Prince Louis realized that he had no chance of taking the English crown. His power in England now consisted entirely of the city of London, blockaded by land and sea by William Marshal. Quite wisely, Louis began negotiating with William Marshal and secured a payment of 10,000 marks to himself in exchange for leaving England and renouncing his claim to the throne. With a child king on the throne, William Marshal became King of England in all but name. The Marshal spent the last 2 years of his life reconciling the former rebels by granting pardons to those who fought for Prince Louis. He also reissued Magna Carta under his own seal as a means to assure the barons that the abuses of John's reign would not be repeated. However, the charter's most radical idea, that a council of 25 nobles would personally supervise the king at all times, was removed by William Marshal. Yet in generations to come, the language of Magna Carta, asserting that men had rights that no king could take away, was being used in courts across England, likely in ways that the conservative barons of 1215 never imagined or even desired. The First Barons' War also had one other dramatic effect, though one not immediately noticed. After the expensive failure of John's effort to reclaim Normandy in 1214, the Norman barons ruling England had no choice but to accept the loss of their ancestral homeland. Indeed, during the wars against Capetian France in the 13th century, some younger Norman knights began seeing French as the language of the enemy. The use of French among the English aristocracy slowly began to fade as the Norman nobility accepted England as their home. The cultural divide between nobles and peasants did not vanish, but the nobles gradually ceased to be aliens in their own kingdom. Indeed, by the time of the 100 Years' War, many English nobles, themselves the descendants of Norman conquerors, proudly called themselves Englishmen fighting against the French. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.